Hello, and welcome back to another social psychology lecture. For today's lecture, we're going to be changing topics a bit. So we just finished talking about social influence. We're going to move on to a completely unrelated topic, or well, I shouldn't say completely unrelated because there are some relationships, but it's going to be a fairly different topic when we talk about attraction today. Um, but understanding attraction and what makes people attracted to others, whether it's romantically or just as friends or whatever, is an important topic to discuss for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that we've already seen in this class how attraction can matter in terms of other social psychology. So, for example, when we talked about compliance, we talked about the compliance principle of liking, um, in that we're more likely to comply with people that we like. And one of the factors that leads us to like someone is physical attraction. So we need to understand what leads us to be attracted to people, either physically or in other ways as well, just to understand things like compliance. We're going to see later on when we talk about helping that we're more likely to help people that we're attracted to or that we like, I guess I should say, or that people who we find physically attractive. So again, it's important to understand attraction just to understand other parts of social psychology. So, with that being said, we're first going to explore some factors that are related to attraction. And in fact, the number one factor, the number one predictor of whether two people are attracted to one another. And again, I mean this not necessarily only in the romantic or sexual sense, although that could still apply, but even just in terms of friendships. Okay. But the number one predictor of what makes two people like each other is something that is so obvious that we probably overlook it. And that is how physically close two people are. What this means is that the closer two people are physically in physical space, the closer they live to each other, the closer they work to each other, um, the more likely they are to be friends. And this makes a lot of sense, obviously, right? Like if you think about most of your friends, probably most of your friends are in Miami or South Florida in general. You probably don't have a lot of friends in Alaska or Russia. Now, you might, but probably most of your friends are in South Florida, right? And of course, the reason for this is obvious, which is that we just simply come in contact more often with people that we're close to. You come in contact with other FIU students. So, because you're geographically proximal to each other, you're more likely to develop a friendship because you probably don't come into contact that often with people from Alaska, let's say. This is like the number one, the biggest predictor of whether two people like each other, because the more times they interact, the more opportunity there is to simply form a friendship. And we can look at this on a smaller scale as well. I mean, it's certainly true globally, but this applies even on a much smaller scale. So, for example, this is a study that was done by Leon Festinger. This is the same guy who came up with cognitive dissonance theory and social comparison theory. He's one of the most important social psychologists in the history of the field. Okay. But he wanted to look at how friendships formed as a function of how physically close the people were. So what he did, he took advantage of this university, which randomly paired people up, randomly paired freshmen up in dorm rooms. Okay. And so you can imagine a number of buildings like this one, where each building had 10 dorm rooms, and there were a pair of people within each room. And there's a number of these buildings within relatively close proximity to one another. And all he did is at the end of the semester, he went in and he interviewed the people who lived in these dorms and asked them who their friends were. So we can see which people formed friends with which other people over the course of that first semester. What he found, which is maybe not surprising, is that the most likely friendships that were formed were roommates. The next most likely friendships that were formed were people who lived one door down. So in this case, like people who lived in room three versus room four. Um, and the next most with people who live two doors down, like room four and room two, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, the more geographically close these rooms were, the more likely the people in those rooms were to form friendships, even on this much, much smaller scale. It's obviously not a global scale, right? Um, this is true even if you looked at across buildings, even though the other buildings were close by, the majority of people's friends were in the same building that they lived in. People on the bottom floor tended to be friends with people on the bottom floor. People on the upper floor tended to be friends with people on the upper floor. The one exception to this was people in rooms one and five tended to also be friends with people on the top floor, which you can probably figure out why, which is that they're right by the staircase, right? So people on the top floor had to pass by those rooms to go up to their rooms. And so people in rooms one and five simply had a lot more opportunity to come in contact with people from the top floor. Now, although this is sort of obvious in a sense, it's something we often overlook because I think we tend to think that our friends are the people who we like the best. And that may not necessarily be true. We may just happen to become friends with people that we interact with the most. In fact, this concept was captured by this quote here by Sir Peter Ustinov. Contrary to popular belief, I do not believe that friends are necessarily the people you like best. They are merely the people who got there first. Indeed, right? And in fact, this leads me to a little bit of a digression, right? So, if you're maybe in a dating relationship, then maybe you thought of your partner as being the one, right? Or people are always looking for the one person in this world that would complete them, the one partner that was placed on this earth just for them. What I would argue is that that perception is completely wrong. There's no such thing as the one. Rather, in my belief, there are maybe 10,000 people scattered around the world that you would consider the one had you met them first. But you didn't. You met your partner first. And maybe your partner is one of those 10,000. But had you met a different one of those 10,000, you'd be calling them the one, right? It's just a matter of which person you came in contact with. I mean, after all, don't you think it's remarkably coincidental that the one person always happens to go to the same school as you or happens to live in the same city as you? I mean, they're not just somewhere in India or China or Russia or Australia or something, and you never met them. I mean, what a remarkable coincidence that you happen to meet that one person, right? Clearly you can tell I'm a romantic, obviously, right? Um, like I'll be with a woman and she'll say, Steve, tell me why you love me. And I'll say, you're in the neighborhood, you know. But it's science, right? Like you can't argue with that. It's science. Um, Actually, no, but in all seriousness, I actually think that my perspective is actually the more romantic one. Okay. And the reason is this: if there is such a thing as the one, this one person on earth you're destined to be with, then when you end up with them, you didn't really have a choice in the matter, right? They're already sort of predestined to be that one person for you. But if there are 10,000 the ones, 10,000 people that you would be, really happy being with, then when you choose one of those people, you are choosing them over 9,999 other people, right? And it seems to me that that's a much more romantic idea to deliberately choose one person at the expense of everybody else, rather than just be with someone that you were destined to be with. Okay, but back to the topic. Another factor that affects or influences how much we're going to be, how much we like someone, is how much we've been exposed to them, how much we see them, due to what's known as the mere exposure effect, which I believe we already talked about a little bit. The mere exposure effect simply means that the more you're exposed to something, that could be a song, it could be a painting, it could be a person, the more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to like it. Obviously, there are limitations on this. If you initially don't like something, then the more you're exposed to it, typically the more you're going to tend to dislike it, right? So this is under the assumption that we're starting off with at least a slightly positive perspective on this thing. There's also limits in terms of like if I played you a song and I played you that same song 100 times in a row, you're probably going to hate that song at the end of that, right? Because you've just been saturated. So, we're not talking about those cases, but in general, the more you're exposed to something, you tend to like it. There's a study that looked at this. There have been multiple studies that have looked at this in various contexts. But one study that looked at this in relation to people was that there was a psychology professor who had three sections of a class, and he had a graduate student attend either every single class for one of those three sections, or only half the classes for another one of the sections, or none of the classes for the third section. She didn't interact with anybody in the class. She didn't like talk to the professor during class, nothing like that. She came into class, sat down, and left. And at the end of the semester, the professor put her face on the on like the PowerPoint slide, let's say, at the front of the class, and had everybody in the class rate her in terms of how much they liked her. And again, no one had ever interacted with her, right? The only difference between the three sections was how often they had seen her in class. And what they showed in that study was that in the class in which she attended every single class, they rated her the highest. In the class where she went to only half the classes, they rated her the second highest. And in the class where they never seen her before because she never went to any classes, they rated her the lowest. So again, this is consistent with the mere exposure effect in the sense that the more they saw her, the more they were exposed to her, the more they tended to like her. Another factor that affects who we like is similarity, because after all, as we saw before in this class, we tend to like ourselves a whole lot, at least in this culture. And so if you're just like me, of course, I'm going to tend to like you as well because I like my qualities. You have the same qualities as me. So I'm going to tend to like you as well. And that's true in like almost every domain that's been studied. This is a very replicable finding. There are some exceptions. Like, for instance, I believe that I think it's like dominant people tend not to like other dominant people because they can clash. They tend to like submissive people because they're submissive to their dominance. So in that sense, um, similarity may not breed attraction in that very specific sense, but most of the time it does. So the more similar two people are in terms of their backgrounds, their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, their interests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the more they tend to like each other. There's always exceptions, of course, but in general, that tends to be true. And related to this idea, some researchers have proposed what they call the matching hypothesis, which is that people tend to end up in romantic relationships with people who are at about the same level of physical attractiveness as they are, as rated by outside observers. Okay. Which is similar to this idea that we tend to like people who are similar to us in this sense, in terms of physical attractiveness. The point here, though, is that the saying that opposites attract is generally speaking not true. Again, there could always be exceptions, but generally speaking, it's not true that opposites attract. Another factor that sort of seems obvious once you hear about it, that determines who we like, is that we like people who like us, which makes a lot of sense because, again, as we've seen, we like to feel good about ourselves, right? We like to have that high self-esteem. And when people like us, that feeds into that need, that desire for that self-esteem makes us feel good. So of course we tend to like them. I mean, at the very least, they have great taste for liking us, right? And so just to demonstrate this, I'll give you the results of, what I consider to be one of the most obvious studies in all of social psychology, in which two participants who had never met each other before interacted for a brief period on some task, let's just say 15 minutes. The researcher then separates them and talks to each one individually. However, in this setup, experimental setup, there's only one real participant. The other person is a confederate that's only pretending to be a participant, but is actually working with the experimenter. And so when the experimenter splits them up into separate rooms, the experimenter always goes to the confederate first. And when they're talking to the confederate, the experimenter accidentally leaves the door open so that the real participant can hear the interaction that's going on. And so at that point, the participant is randomly assigned to a condition in which their partner either says, like the researcher's asking them, like, how much did you like your partner? And the real participant's partner either says that they like them, that they didn't like them, or they don't give a response, or the participant can't hear the response. And then after that, the researcher goes to the real participant and asks them, how much did you like your partner? And in one of the least surprising findings in all of social psychology, if you heard that your partner likes you, then you tend to like them. If you heard your partner doesn't like you, you tend not to like them. I mean, pretty obvious, right? What it means, in effect, though, is that if you're interested in getting to know someone, either on a romantic level or even on just a friendship level, one of the best things you can do is to let them know that you like them, right? Because we like people who like us. So that will tend to make that person like you more. I mean, again, that's not a guarantee by any means, but in general, as a tendency, that's going to tend to be the case. But a factor I want to spend a little bit more time talking about that's a little bit less obvious in terms of determining who we like is the level of physiological arousal that we happen to have when we come in contact with a given person. Because it turns out that if you are experiencing, let's say, excitement or nervousness or something along those lines, so your physiological arousal levels are elevated, um, you will tend to like that person more. When I talk about physiological arousal levels, what I mean is that like uh, your heart is beating fast, you got maybe butterflies in your stomach, you're a little shaky, your palms are sweaty, those sorts of things. And that sort of reaction happens when you are excited, when you're nervous, when you're scared, all of those sorts of things, right? So this idea is based on a concept known as misattribution of arousal. It's sometimes also called excitation transfer. Okay. I think The textbook refers to it as misattribution of arousal. That's how I learned it. That's how I've seen it referred to most of the time. So that's how I'm going to refer to it now, but they're basically interchangeable, those terms. So here's the basic idea. Okay. When we experience that physiological arousal, our heart's beating and we have sweaty palms, we feel the butterflies in our stomach. Um, that feeling you have when maybe you're a little bit nervous or anxious or something along those lines. We want to know what caused it, obviously. We want to know what's causing us to feel like that so that we can do something about it. If it's an uncomfortable feeling, we want to be able to eliminate it, for example. And if it's excitement, and maybe we want to try to sit in that excitement a little bit longer, right? So when we experience that arousal, we want to attribute it to a source. And most of the time we know what the source is. So if you're like 5 minutes away from a final exam and your graduation depends on you passing this exam, you could probably figure out that the reason you feel that way is because you're nervous, right? Um, so we know a lot of the time what's causing our physiological arousal. But sometimes we make mistakes. And sometimes we think our arousal is caused by factor A, when in fact it was caused by factor B. We say in that case that we are misattributing the source of our arousal, hence the name misattribution of arousal. So, for example, maybe it's the case that you had like an extra cup of coffee that morning that you normally don't have. And as a consequence of that, like an hour later, your heart's beating faster. And, we know that caffeine increases your arousal levels. But because it's not your normal routine to have that extra cup of coffee, we don't think that the coffee caused that arousal. And so we're looking for an explanation. And maybe it's the case that we happen to be meeting an attractive person at that time that we're trying to figure out what's causing this arousal. And what we may think is that it's the person that's causing us to feel that physiological arousal, when in reality, it was actually the caffeine. As a consequence, we can come to think we're more attracted to this person than we otherwise are. And again, like note that this is all consistent with things I've been talking about since the beginning of the semester, when I talked about how we sort of have a lack of introspective awareness and we engage in self-perception. We try to figure out what we're feeling or what our thoughts are by thinking about our past behavior, right? That we don't simply know ourselves as well as we think we do. And here's another example of that, where we don't know what's causing us to feel that arousal and we think it's due to something else. So let me describe to you a famous study that looked at this concept. This was done in, I think it's Vancouver, um, where there's a bridge, Capilano Bridge. This is an image of Capilano Bridge. And you can see that it's a bridge you walk over, but it's really high up off the ground, right? And you can see it's like wobbly. It's not like secured, right? So it would be kind of scary potentially to walk over this thing if it's wobbling back and forth. And if you fall, you're basically dead because it's 230 feet above rapids. Okay. So researchers talked to men, and we'll see why it's only men in just a second. They talked to men who had either just crossed this wobbly, shaky bridge, or they talked to men who had just crossed this really sturdy concrete bridge that was only 10 feet above the ground. It didn't wobble at all. It's not scary in any way, right? So what should happen is that when the researchers talk to these men, the men who just crossed the shaky bridge should be experiencing more physiological arousal in the form of nervousness than men who had just crossed the sturdy bridge. So what happened is that this female experimenter approaches these men after they crossed one of these two bridges, and she says something like, "Hey, we're doing a study. Would you be willing to give us 5 minutes to help us, conduct this study?" And so the men tend to agree. And then once they do, the woman says something like, "Okay, I'm going to give you some words, and I want you to just, off the top of your head, create a spontaneous story around these words." Okay. Now, the exact instructions, what they're doing here doesn't matter so much, as we'll see. But, the men are able to come up with some spontaneous story off the top of their heads, right? Once they're done telling that story, the woman says, "Thank you for doing this. If you're interested in the results of the study, here's my phone number. Feel free to give me a call." So she gives all the men her phone number. Now, really, what's happening is that the researchers are interested in whether these men will call this woman sort of under the guise of trying to find out the results of the research, but really because they're attracted to her. So the percentage of men who called this woman is a rough proxy, roughly, for how attracted they are to her. And so what they show is that the men who crossed the shaky bridge, okay, the men who crossed the shaky bridge were much more likely to call this woman than were the men who had crossed the sturdy bridge. And so the interpretation of this was due to misattribution of arousal. Again, so the men who had crossed the shaky bridge were feeling their heightened arousal because they were nervous, right? And so they're in that heightened arousal state when they meet this attractive woman. And as they're interacting with her, they're noticing, hey, my heart's beating quickly, and I've got butterflies in my stomach, and I'm a little shaky. My palms are sweaty. Wow, this must mean I'm really attracted to her, right? In other words, they're inferring their own emotional reaction based on an observation of their physiological responses, kind of consistent with self-perception theory, as we talked before. And so they misattributed the source of their arousal. They thought it was because they were attracted to the woman, when it was in reality, it was because they were actually nervous about crossing the bridge. There's one issue with this study, though, because what misattribution of arousal states is that when you're in a heightened state of physiological arousal, that can cause you to be more attracted to someone. The word cause is critical here, right? Because when we're talking about cause-effect relationships, what that means is that we need to have an experiment. And one of the hallmarks of an experiment is that we have to randomly assign people to conditions. But that didn't happen here, right? The woman just approached men who, of their own volition, had either crossed the shaky bridge or the sturdy bridge. So it introduces potential confounds. So, for example, maybe it's the case that men who chose to cross the shaky bridge were, on average, more courageous than men who had crossed the sturdy bridge. That would explain why they were willing to cross the shaky bridge, right? And if they're more courageous, maybe that's the reason they were more likely to call the woman later on. Maybe it had nothing to do with physiological arousal. Maybe it just had to do with the personality of the men who had crossed these two bridges. So the only way to rule out that other explanation is to conduct an actual experiment where people are randomly assigned to conditions. So that's what this study's about. This is a very simple study. The researchers simply had men, they randomly assigned them to run in place for either 15 seconds or for 2 minutes. This is effectively a manipulation of their physiological arousal. If you run in place for 2 minutes versus 15 seconds, you're going to have, your heartbeat's going to be elevated. You're going to be a little shaky, that sort of thing. It increases your arousal levels. So then all the men saw a recording of an attractive woman, okay? And then had to rate how attractive they thought she was. And what they showed is men who had been running in place for 2 minutes rated that woman as being more attractive compared to men who had been running in place for only 15 seconds. So again, consistent with this concept of misattribution of arousal, the arousal that was actually created by exercise was being misattributed as being attraction to this woman. And so what that means is that the extent to which you find yourself attracted to someone is not just a function of that person and who they are. It's also a function, in part, of your level of arousal at the moment you happen to meet that person. If you meet them in situations that elevate your arousal, you're going to tend to be more attracted to them compared to if you meet them in situations in which your arousal is lower. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about physical attractiveness because we know that a lot of social behavior is a function of how physically attractive we find someone. So we're more likely to comply with someone that we find physically attractive, for instance. We're more likely to help someone that we find physically attractive. So we should delve into this a little bit more. When we say we're physically attracted to someone, like what does that actually mean? Well, first off, let me describe a study that underscores the importance of physical attraction in developing liking for someone. This was a study where university freshmen were randomly paired. A man and a woman were randomly paired together to go to a dance. Okay, so they never met each other before. It's like basically like a blind date, right? And at the end of that dance, the researchers gave these people a questionnaire individually that asked them a number of questions in which they had to rate their partner in terms of like how physically attractive are they, how funny are they, how good are they at conversation, all sorts of characteristics they had to rate. Then at the very end, they asked people, yes or no question, would you like to see this person again or not? So what that means is researchers can correlate whether someone wanted to see their partner again or not with their responses to all these other questions, how attractive they thought they were, how good of a conversationalist they were, etc. And what they showed is that only one of those factors predicted or was associated with whether they wanted to see this person again. And that was how physically attractive they thought they were. If they thought their partner was physically attractive, they tended to want to see them again. If they didn't, they tended not to want to see them again. So physical attraction, in other words, was a really important predictor, a really important variable in determining how or whether they wanted to see this person again. Which isn't to say that all these other characteristics don't matter, because of course they matter. What this is saying is that at least in the short term, when you just start to get to know someone, the level of physical attraction you have for them is a really big predictor of whether you want to see them again. Of course, as you get to know someone more and more over time, all sorts of other variables matter as well in terms of whether you like that person, obviously. But physical attraction is important, at least in that short term. And so the question that we might want to address here is where does that feeling of attraction come from? Is there something inherent about certain characteristics that people have that lead us to be attracted to them? Or is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Is attraction purely subjective? And you can make arguments on both sides. So, for example, we do certainly know that judgments of beauty do change across time. There are differences across cultures, there are differences across circumstances. Suggesting that there's some sort of subjective component or maybe personalized component that depending on the circumstances you find yourself in, depending on your culture, et cetera, and the time period that you're in, we think different people are more or less attractive. So for instance, if you look, hundreds of years ago, if you look at paintings, some famous paintings, and the depiction of sort of the ideal female body, let's say. So these are obviously male artists that are depicting sort of the ideal female form. It tends to look something more like this, where the women are a little bit larger, right? Whereas if you look today, sort of the perception of the idealized woman tends to be much thinner, right? So that's what I mean when I say that judgments of beauty can change across time. So again, suggesting that they're not necessarily ingrained in us. However, there are also a number of lines of evidence, at least three, that suggest that there is some sort of biological component to attraction. In other words, that there are certain specific features that tend to be consistently associated with whether we find someone attractive. So I'll describe these three pieces of evidence. So first off, there's a set of studies you can conduct where you take an infant, right, or like a baby, like 2 months old or whatever, and you place them in a caretaker's lap, usually a mother, but it could be a father as well. And then you show them two images on two different screens, okay, just like we're seeing here in this picture. And then there's a little hole at the top of this wall here. And basically that's there because the experimenter is behind the wall looking at the baby's eyes to see which picture, which image the baby's looking at. Now that researcher doesn't know what images are being shown. So they're sort of blind to what image is being shown, but they can see which one the baby's looking at. Now the idea here is that whatever the baby looks at more or spends more time looking at, the assumption is that that means they like that thing more or they find it more attractive in some way. So you can show them any two images, but what that means is you can show them two different people, images of people's faces. One that people would, like the adults in that culture, would consider to be physically attractive, and one that the adults in that culture would consider to be less physically attractive. And you can see which one does the baby look at. And if you repeat this process multiple times, what researchers tend to find is that babies tend to look longer at the face where the adults consider that to be physically attractive. But the question then is, why? Why is the baby looking at that face more? I mean, after all, the baby hasn't been reading Cosmopolitan magazine. The baby hasn't learned culturally what people within that culture find attractive. And so this can't just be a learned response. And that suggests there's a biological component that we're sort of like hardwired roughly to find certain types of faces more attractive than others. Second line of evidence is that although there are differences cross-culturally in terms of what people find beautiful, there's also more consistency, more similarities than we might expect by chance alone. So for example, what some researchers have done is they've gone to, like, let's say tribes, tribes that kind of live on their own, that have no exposure to any other culture other than their own, that they're not aware of Western culture. They might be, maybe they've never seen a white person before. Okay. And what you can do is take, let's say, six faces of, let's say, white people from this culture, and you go to this tribe and you show them these six faces, and you have them order them in terms of most attractive to least attractive. And you compare that ordering to how people from Western culture would rate those same six faces. And what you tend to find is that there's more consistency across the Western culture and this tribe, this isolated tribe, than you would expect by chance alone. And the opposite would also be true. If you took pictures of six different people from that tribe and you show them the people from Western culture and you have them rank order those faces from most to least attractive, again, we tend to find that they roughly match up with the rank ordering of people from that tribe. This is suggesting that attraction isn't only socially or culturally created, because if it were, then we wouldn't expect to find that sort of similarity. It's suggesting that there is some sort of biological um, tendency, I guess I'll say, to find certain types of faces more attractive, which would explain why people from completely different cultures oftentimes have somewhat similar ratings. And finally, researchers have identified certain features that are consistently and reliably associated with attractiveness, regardless of culture. Um, Things like clear skin tends to be thought of as attractive across almost all cultures, right? And so again, this is suggesting that attraction is not purely cultural or social, because if it were, again, we wouldn't expect to find this degree of consistency and reliability. It does suggest that there might be some sort of biological inclination to find certain types of features attractive. So let's explore that a little bit. Oops, because it raises the question, what is attractive? I mean, most people probably find at least one of these two people to be physically attractive, for example. And the question is, if you find one of these people attractive, what is it about them that's triggering that feeling of attraction towards that person? What is considered to be attractive? Now, again, I want to make a couple caveats here. Um, there's always exceptions to everything, right? This is not going to be true for every single person. These are just tendencies for people. And secondly, I want to point out that most research historically I mean, psychology in general, including social psychology, has been conducted by men for cultural reasons, misogyny and things like that. And so as a consequence, and it tends to be sort of heteronormative. So it tends to be mostly men who research what men find attractive in women. There has been research the other way, when what women find attractive in men. There's been research in terms of what men find attractive in men and what women find attractive in women. But most of the research tends to be what heterosexual men find attractive in women, partly because of the historical biases that have existed culturally. Okay, so with those caveats out of the way, one of the factors that in this case that men tend to find attractive in women is what's known as a waist to hip ratio. So if you were to take a tape measure and measure your waist and you put that in the numerator of a fraction, then you take the tape measure, measure your hips, put that in the denominator of the fraction. The closer that value is to 0.7, in other words, your waist is 70% the size of your hips, the closer that number is to 0.7, the more men tend to find that attractive. And that's true regardless of the absolute size of the woman, regardless of like how overall big she is, that it's that ratio that tends to matter a lot. There's a number of studies that have looked at this. One study involved researchers who analyzed Playboy centerfolds over the course of like decades, which sounds like an excuse to just look at Playboys, I think. But regardless, that's what they did. So what they did is they took the measurements of the Playboy centerfolds over the course of decades. Okay. And what they showed is that although over time, the absolute size of the centerfolds got smaller, the waist to hip ratio stayed pretty much exactly the same across the decades. And it was almost exactly 0.7. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, except that it suggests that to the extent that Playboy sort of knows what men are finding most attractive in women and therefore are using centerfolds that match that idealized expectation, to the extent they're doing that, to the extent they're accurate, that would suggest that men tend to find this waist hip ratio of 0.7 to be most attractive. But we can also look at this in a more rigorous way. So you can bring participants into a lab and you can show them this card, something like this. Now these women differ in two respects. So as you go from left to right, regardless of which row you're in, if you go from left to right, you're increasing the waist to hip ratio. Okay. So the woman in the leftmost column have a waist hip ratio of 0.7, woman in the next column, 0.8, 0.9, 1.0. So that's what the WHR means here. That's waist to hip ratio. And as you go from row to row, as you go from the top to the bottom, the women are increasing in absolute size. So the women at the top row are lighter than the women in the middle row, who are lighter than the woman in the bottom row. Okay. And so within each row, you can ask male participants which of these women they find most attractive. And regardless of the absolute size of the woman, men consistently tend to choose the woman who has the waist hip ratio of 0.7 as being most attractive. And obviously, you can extend this. You can show them diagrams of women who have a waist hip ratio of 0.6 and 0.5. And what you tend to find, though, is that people find that 0.7 to be maximally attractive. And that's true regardless of the absolute size of the woman. Okay, so waist hip ratio seems to be an important characteristic and important in terms of what it triggers in terms of our feelings of attraction towards other people. They've also done some research looking at what women tend to find maximally attractive in men. And that they've looked at that in terms of waist hip ratio. And they do find that there is sort of this ideal waist hip ratio for men, which is around 0.9 or 1.0. The closer men are to that, the more heterosexual women tend to find that to be attractive. Another characteristic that in particular men tend to find attractive in women are what are known as baby-faced features. Um, what this means, which sounds a little bit odd at first, but bear with me, but what it means is that men tend to find features that are associated with babies to be attractive in women, which I know sounds very, very weird, but hold on. So, for example, if you look at a baby's face, the eyes are bigger proportionally to its head than with adults. So, what that means is women who have relatively large eyes tend to be found to be more attracted by men. Women who have other baby-faced features, like having a big forehead, having round cheeks, having a small nose, wide smile, these are all features that are associated with babies that men tend to find attractive in women as well. Okay. So for example, I grew up in the 90s, right? As a teenager and things. And so my celebrity crush at the time was Alicia Silverstone. And she really exemplifies, I think, a lot of these baby face features with her big eyes and big lips and that sort of thing. Um, Angelina Jolie can be considered to have a lot of these features. She has big forehead, she has the big eyes, the big lips. Now she does have one feature that babies don't have, which we'll come back to in just a second. But you can see this in all sorts of other areas as well. If you think about, and again, I'm dating myself here by going back to the Spice Girls from the 90s, but the pop band, the Spice Girls, had five people in that band or in that uh, group, I guess. One of whom was literally called Baby Spice. Like her characteristic was that she had baby-like features. It's probably not a coincidence that that happened. It's probably because people tend to find that attractive, and so that's kind of her role within that group. So historically, this is Brigitte Bardot, considered to be sort of a sex symbol at the time, and she has a lot of these baby face features as well, with the big eyes and the big lips and that sort of thing. This is Kate Moss, and this is a 3-year-old girl. And there are certain similarities between the faces in terms of the forehead and the eyes and the lips and that sort of thing. Um, and Kate Moss, of course, being a model and considered to be attractive. And so, again, this is sort of consistent with the concept that babyface features are thought to be attractive. However, Kate Moss, just like Angelina Jolie, has one characteristic, or well, at least one major characteristic that is not associated with baby-faced features, and that is cheekbones. Because little kids don't have pronounced cheekbones, right? They kind of have chubby cheeks. Whereas, a lot mature women, adult women tend to a lot of times tend to have cheekbones, right? So the idea here is that from an evolutionary perspective, if men were only attracted to baby face features, full stop, they might be attracted to not non-adult women, which is not only, pretty gross to think about in and of itself, but is also not a viable evolutionary strategy. And so evolution should have led to the development of an attraction towards at least one feature that signifies sexual maturity. And in that case, that would be cheekbones. If men were attracted to cheekbones in conjunction with baby face features, that would sort of ensure that they were attracted to adult women. Another factor that people consider in terms of, I don't mean consciously consider, I guess I mean another factor that people find to be attractive is the symmetry of the face. So if you were to drop a line down the middle of a face like this, the more the right and left sides mirror each other, the more symmetrical they are, the more people tend to find that face to be attractive. The less symmetrical they are, the less people tend to find it attractive. And we're going to come back to that in just a second, because I want to talk a little bit about that in relation to this last point as well, which is that if you were to take a number of individual faces, photos of people's faces, okay, and you merge them together, and there's software that you can use to do this, to merge faces together, and you produce a composite face. So this composite face is generated by merging the four faces together. It's not a real person, but they often look very real. That composite face, you might expect that if you thought about the attractiveness of that face, it would be the average of the four faces, let's say, that went into it. But that's not what happens. What happens is that when you blend these faces together, the composite face oftentimes becomes more attractive than any of the individual faces that went into it. Okay, so you can have other people like rate the attractiveness of the four people's faces and then rate the attractiveness of the composite face. And you don't tell them which one's a composite or which one's real or not. And they will tend to rate the composite face as being most attractive, which is a little bit counterintuitive, right? You might think that, again, that it should be the average of the other faces, but it's not. It tends to be more attractive. And I want to give you some examples and talk about why that's the case. So this is not a real person. This is a composite face that was created by merging four faces together. And you can produce a composite image, then you could take four other faces and merge them together. So 8 faces total. You can do the same thing, make 16 faces, 32 faces. And you can also do the same thing with male faces. Okay. So again, this is a composite image, not a real person, composed of 4 faces, 8 faces, 16 faces, or 32 faces. And what most people tend to see is that if you look at these faces, they become more attractive the more faces that you're blending together. So not only does blending faces tend to produce a highly attractive face, but the more faces you use, the more attractive that composite face tends to get. And most people see that roughly within these images here. These, again, are not real people. These are composite images. These were composed of, I think, 64 faces each. Okay. And most people tend to find them to be quite attractive faces. Okay. And so, again, the question we're dealing with is, why is it the case that blending faces together produces highly attractive faces? Well, there's a few reasons. Okay, let's talk about 2 of them. So first off, note that these faces tend to be almost perfectly symmetrical. So if you were to drop a line to the middle of the female face, the middle of the male face, the right and left sides of those faces are almost perfectly symmetrical to each other. And we saw before that symmetry tends to lead us to find that face attractive. So one of the effects of blending faces together that it produces symmetrical faces, which we already find to be attractive. But it's more than just that. So imagine this. Let's say I'm taking 64 faces of real people and blending them together. And maybe person 1, when I take this picture, is having kind of a bad hair day, right? And person 2 has a mole on their face. And person 3 has a zit on their nose. And every individual face has some sort of, quote unquote, flaw. But all the flaws are different because we're just randomly choosing these photos. So what happens is that when you merge these 64 faces together, person 1 was having a bad hair day, but the other 63 people weren't having the same sort of bad hair day they were. So the bad hair gets washed out when you combine them with 63 other faces. And person 2 had a mole on their face, but the other 63 people didn't have a mole in the same place on their face. So when you merge them together, the mole disappears. And person 3 had a zit on their nose, but if the other 63 faces didn't have a zit on their nose, then that gets washed away when you combine them with the other faces. And so what happens is that every sort of, imperfection, we'll say, gets basically diluted. It gets washed out when you combine it with all these other faces. And as a consequence, you end up with these composite faces whose skin is like immaculately smooth, right? There's no blemishes, there's no flaws. There, like everything seems so smooth, all the features and everything. And that's because all the individual idiosyncratic features of our faces get sort of washed out. So it produces these very attractive looking faces. But this is sort of counterintuitive, as I said, right? And that has led some people to draw faulty conclusions or to try things based on faulty premises, which sort of undermine the point they were trying to make. But I'm being a little vague here, so let me be more specific. For example, there was an organization that was trying to reduce drug use. Okay. And so one of the strategies they had was they were going to show people what a typical drug user looks like. And so what they did is they took faces of actual drug users and they merged them together, thinking that by doing so, they're creating an average face. They didn't realize, though, that by doing so, by merging these faces together, it produces a very attractive face. As a consequence, when they tried to show what a typical drug user looks like, they actually accidentally created a very, very attractive face. For example, this is supposed to be the typical marijuana user, right? Which they got by merging the faces together, which, I mean, doesn't look bad at all to me, right? These look like pretty attractive people. But that's only marijuana. Let's try some other drugs. So these are people who were arrested for DUIs. Okay, so we're looking at alcohol here. Again, they tend to be pretty attractive people. But okay, maybe let's go to something like meth. Meth is sort of known for its effects it can have on your physical appearance, right? So certainly we wouldn't find that with meth, but we do, right? We still find relatively attractive people here. Again, probably are very often more attractive than any of the individual faces that went into it. So by trying to show people what a typical meth user looks like, they accidentally created a particularly attractive meth user, which is going to kind of backfire on them if people start to think, well, wait a second, if I use meth and I'm going to look like this, that sounds pretty good to me. Okay, so um, uh, I sort of briefly mentioned evolution a few minutes ago in terms of attraction, and I want to explore that a little bit more. I'm not going to go over the details of this because I mean, it would take like years to understand all the details of natural selection, that sort of thing. So I'm going to give you a very, very, very quick and dirty overview, okay, in case you're not as familiar with the concept of evolution by natural selection. So imagine this. Imagine that I have a new gene, a part of my DNA that somehow what it leads is that whenever I touch a woman, that woman becomes pregnant. Okay. That's like my DNA that has that gene. Okay. Um, I shake their hand, boom, pregnant, right? I bump by on the street, I bump into someone or something, boom, pregnant. Well, what happens is that I'm the only person in the world that has a copy of that gene. Okay. But because every time I touch a woman, they get pregnant, if you fast forward 20 years, there's going to be like hundreds, thousands of little Dr. Charmans running around, right? Because of all these women that got pregnant by me. Ooh, that sounds really weird. And I'm not saying it's because I go around touching women, obviously. I'm just saying because, like, if I shake their hand or something, right, to get pregnant. So what happens is that 20 years after me, there's now like hundreds of people that have the gene that I had, which means when they grow up and they touching women, they're going to get all those women pregnant, which means in the next generation, there's going to be tens of thousands of people that have that gene. So there started off being one copy of that gene in me. Within a couple generations, there's thousands of copies of that gene. If you fast forward it even more, basically we get to a point where basically everybody in the population has that gene, which is all to say that any gene that increases the likelihood of reproducing, having babies, basically will spread through a population over time. Okay. And conversely, if I had a gene that led me to be sterile, I couldn't have offspring. By definition, I cannot pass that gene on to my offspring because I can't have offspring, right? So there might be a copy of that gene in me, but when I die, that gene dies as well. The gene gets wiped out, right? So this is another way of saying that any gene that decreases the likelihood of reproduction will tend to die out over time. Okay. Now, what this means is that because today we are the products of hundreds and thousands of generations of our ancestors, The genes we have today, the DNA we have today, we tend to have because it helped our ancestors reproduce like hundreds of thousands of years ago. Now, this is a drastically oversimplified way of thinking about evolution. There's a lot of nuance and details and things here, but that I'm skipping over because it's not a biology class. But it's a basic sort of general overview of how this works. So if we think about what our current preferences are, if our preferences in terms of what we find attractive are based in our DNA, then that suggests that those preferences we have now, we have them because they helped our ancestors reproduce hundreds of thousands of years ago, let's say. So let's look at what sort of preferences men and women tend to have now in romantic partners. Um, so first off, what we tend to find is that men tend to prefer women who have features associated with reproductive ability. What I mean by this, well, first off, note that I have prefer in quotes because this isn't necessarily a conscious preference. I'm not saying men look at women and say, oh, yeah, she can have a lot of babies. I really like her. They're not consciously thinking that, right? But what I mean is that the types of features that they tend to be attracted to, they're attracted to because those types of women who had those features hundreds of thousands of years ago were able to have more babies. So, for example, men tend to prefer younger women compared to older women. Um, if you ask men their preference in terms of uh, how old they're what age of women they're most attractive to, what you tend to find are like in their 20s, something like that. Okay, as opposed to women in their 50s, let's say. Why is that the case? Well, if we think about this, let's rewind the clock 100,000 years, right? And let's say that within all the males, some of those males liked women in their 20s, and some of them had DNA that led them to like women in their 80s. That's who they were attracted to. Well, here's the thing. The men who happen to be attracted to women in their 20s would tend to have a lot of babies because women in their 20s are sort of maximally fertile and able to have babies, right? But men who are attracted to women in their 80s, they would not be able to mate, or I should say, they would not be able to have babies anyway, in part because people didn't live to their 80s. So there weren't many people around to mate with, but also because even if they did find someone, a woman in her 80s can't have children, right? So men who happen to have that DNA that led them to be attracted to women in their 80s, that gene was going to die out over time. So if you fast forward back to today, virtually no one should have, at least from a biological perspective, people shouldn't have that attraction to women in their 80s because that gene died out a long time ago. What we should tend to have are genes that lead us to be attracted to women who are able to reproduce. So in this case, let's say women in their 20s, because that's what helped our ancestors reproduce in the past. Furthermore, men tend to put a lot of emphasis on physical attractiveness. They tend to value that. And what that means is that the features we find physically attractive are not inherently physically attractive. It's just that we think of them as being attractive because our ancestors who had genes that led them to be attracted to those features tended to have more offspring. So, in other words, the features we find to be physically attractive now, those features should be associated with the ability to have offspring. So, for example, this would explain why men tend to find women with baby face features attractive, because that would lead them to be attracted to women who are at the age who could reproduce, right? So this is to underscore the fact that attraction or the features we find attractive, that's not inherent. That's not an objective fact of the universe. That's just a subjective feeling that we have because we've inherited a series of genes that lead us to be attracted to those features because that's what helped our ancestors reproduce in the past. Conversely, women tend to prefer men, again, in quotes, not a conscious preference, but they tend to prefer men who have resources. Now, the reason for this is I'm going to have to gloss over because it's a little bit complex, but the basic idea is that if you go back 100,000 years, if a woman had a child, there's that child, there's a lot of children that died back then, like a lot, right? The mortality rate was insane. So if a woman had a child, but there was no one to help her raise it, that child's more likely to die because there's only one caretaker. Whereas if a woman had a child, but there was another person to help raise that child, like the father, that child's more likely to survive. As a consequence, women who were attracted to men who were deadbeats that would just leave them, those women would have a baby, but that baby's more likely to die because the father is a deadbeat. Whereas women who are attracted to men who showed commitment in them would tend to be able to co-parent. The child's more likely to survive and pass on the genes for being attracted to that sort of feature. So, um, women tend to prefer older men. That's a very big sex difference between men and women. Um, and this makes sense because older men have had more time to accrue resources. And by resources, I mean being able to invest in the offspring. Okay. Today, that would mean like that could mean money. 100,000 years ago, it obviously didn't mean money, but it might mean the ability to get meat, right? To hunt, and therefore be able to provide for the offspring. So the offspring's more likely to survive if the father is able to hunt, for example, right? So that would be an example of a resource. So older men have had more time to accrue the resources that they might need to invest in an offspring. And so women who had a preference for younger men, their babies were less likely to survive than women who had a preference for older men who had more resources. Therefore, fast forward to today, women should have a preference for older men. Women should also tend to have a preference for men who have symbols of resources, right? So as I mentioned, today that might mean money, but there's other things that are associated with resources as well. So a man with high status will tend to have more resources than a man with lower status, and women tend to be attracted to things like status or things like ambition, right? Which is the desire to get resources or confidence or things of that nature, right? All of those things are indicators that men have resources from an evolutionary perspective. And so women who were attracted to those things 100,000 years ago had babies that were more likely to survive and pass on the genes for being attracted to those features. And this tends to be cross-cultural. Again, there's always cultural differences, but there are a lot of things that are pretty consistent across culture. So the fact that men tend to prefer women who are younger and women prefer men who are older, we tend to find that across a lot of cultures, most cultures. Okay. So, which would suggest again that these preferences are not culturally based. It suggests that there could be a biological component to those preferences, which fits in with this evolutionary explanation for them. And if you look at this sort of classic trade-off where men prefer younger, physically attractive women and women prefer older men with resources, you can see all sorts of examples of this in society, including Donald Trump, right? I believe his wife is 23 years younger than him. She's a model, and he is like a billionaire, and with power and that sort of thing, right? So you tend to find that sort of classic trade-off where you've got an older man with power and money, and you've got a younger woman with youth and attraction, physically attractive. This is one of the best examples in social psychology, where 89-year-old multi-billionaire J. Howard Marshall married a 26-year-old ex-Playboy model, Anna Nicole Smith. Okay, so he was what is that, 63 years older than her, and a multi-billionaire, right? Old rich man, younger attractive woman. You tend to see that a lot more than the other way around, right? We tend not to see a lot of older rich women with younger physically attractive men. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, obviously it does. But you tend to find it more with older men and younger women than you find the reverse, which would be consistent again with evolutionary theory. Back in the day, before internet dating, okay, before the internet really was a thing, if people wanted to meet other people to date, one option they had was to put personal ads in the newspaper. So you had to pay by the word, though, right? So people had to be very concise in terms of here's what I'm offering, here's what I'm looking for. So some researchers did analyses of these personal ads to see if there were sex differences between what men and women were offering and what they were looking for. So, for example, when they did these analyses, here's a couple of sample ads that they came across. Here's one. Blonde bombshell, 5'7", slender grad student seeking friend, companion, lover. You must be confident, financially secure, mature, and willing to please. Okay, so let's think about this, right? So this is a woman. Um, in fact, it technically doesn't even say it's a woman, but probably that's what everyone assumed because of the way she's talking. I assume she's talking about herself, right, and her partner. So, blonde bombshell 5'7". What I'm offering is I have good looks, right? I'm a bombshell, slender grad student. Grad student meaning I'm relatively young. Um, and I'm looking for someone who is confident, financially secure, who has resources, who's older than me, mature, and is willing to spend those resources on me, right? So again, this is sort of exactly what evolutionary theory predicts, is that women should be like giving away, here's what I'm offering you, attraction, and here's what I want is resources. And if you look at men's ads, you find different, right? So here's an example. White male 50, looking for female to be spoiled and pampered in palatial home. Please be 21 to 34 because 35 is like too old for this 50-year-old anyway, and have extremely sexy figure, right? So here we see the opposite. Here we see a man saying, here's what I have. I'm looking for someone to be pampered in a palatial home, to be spoiled. Like, I have money, I'm rich, and I'm willing to spend it on you and pamper you, right? And in return, what I want is youthfulness and attraction. So that's what tended to happen. Women tended to offer their physical attractiveness and look for resources. Men tended to offer their resources and look for physical attraction. Now, these are obviously extreme examples. Most personal ads aren't as extreme as these are, but on average, that's sort of what you tended to find. Again, consistent with evolutionary reasoning. So earlier in the course, we talked about the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is when a false belief leads to its own fulfillment. And I wanted to just quickly mention a study where they looked at attraction through a lens of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. So here's what they did. These were male participants. And what they did is, after bringing them into the lab, they told them that what they're going to be doing is having a phone conversation with a stranger, a woman they never met before. And they were given a picture of the woman that they were supposedly talking to. Now, in reality, the picture they were given was not of the woman they were talking to, but they gave men a woman, or they gave men a picture of a woman who was either considered to be highly physically attractive or not so physically attractive. So, in other words, these men now have a false belief. I believe I'm talking to this really attractive woman, or I believe I'm talking to this not attractive woman. But remember, that's not who they're actually talking to. So this is a false belief, right? That's step one of a self-fulfilling prophecy, is that someone has a false belief about someone else. So the researchers had two questions. First off, would the men treat the woman differently based on their false beliefs? Would men treat the woman they think are physically attractive better than the woman they thought were physically unattractive? So they recorded these phone conversations and analyzed them. And what they showed is that if a man thought they were talking to an attractive woman, then when they call them on the phone, they say something like, hey, we're doing this study. I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited to get to know you and to talk to you about this. And they're sort of like warm and friendly, right? And on the other hand, um, if the person they were talking to they thought was less attractive, then when they call them on the phone, they're more likely to behave like this, like, hey, I know we're part of the study. Let's get this done, right? They're not very sociable. They're not very friendly. They're not very warm. So they're treating women differently based on their false beliefs that they have towards them. So that was the first question the researchers had. Would the men treat women differently based on their false beliefs? And they did. That's the second step of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second question they had was, would the woman respond to how they were treated? In other words, if they were treated in a friendly manner, would they behave friendly back? If they were treated in an unfriendly manner, would they behave unfriendly back to the men? So they also analyzed the woman's end of these conversations. And what they showed is that the woman did respond accordingly. So, in other words, if the men behaved in a warm and friendly fashion towards her, she behaved in a warm and friendly fashion back to them, right? Makes sense? If the men didn't behave friendly, she didn't behave friendly back. So, what happened, in other words, is that the woman responded to the treatment in a manner that that fulfilled the initial false belief, in a sense. What I mean is this. Because of the halo effect, these men sort of were to believe. Remember, halo effect means if we think that someone has one positive characteristic, we think they have all sorts of other positive characteristics as well. So if I think this woman's attractive, I also think she's warm and friendly. And so I talk to an attractive woman, or a woman I think is attractive in this case, and lo and behold, she behaves really warm and friendly. And when men talk to a woman they don't think is physically attractive, she doesn't behave friendly. So what happens is that these men start to think that attractive women are warm and friendly. And so it's sort of like reconfirming their viewpoint. What they're not realizing is that the reason the women are behaving friendly is not because it's not like being friendly and being attractive go together. It's just that attractive people behave nicer towards them, which elicits nicer behavior in response, right? But the men themselves don't realize that they're treating the woman differently. So from their perspective, it seems like attractive women are really nice and unattractive women are not nice at all, without realizing that's only because they're treating women differently in those cases. Okay, and finally, I want to introduce theory. This is going to come back again later on when we talk about helping. Something known as social exchange theory. And social exchange theory is a very broad theory that we can apply to all sorts of different things, all sorts of different topics in social psychology, including helping, including attraction. And the basic idea behind social exchange theory is that it takes in sort of an economic perspective of decision making in general. And so if we apply it to relationships, we're going to say it takes an economic perspective of relationships, meaning that when we make decisions about relationships, whether to stay in a relationship or whether to end a relationship, for example, we make it based on a sort of a benefit cost analysis. In other words, we want to maximize our benefits with every choice that we make, and we want to minimize our costs. So, for example, if you look at, some of the various benefits of, say, being in a relationship, well, you've got love there, obviously, right? That's a nice benefit. You've always got companionship, someone there. There's sexual benefits of being in that relationship. There's all sorts of these benefits, positives of being in a relationship. But if you look at the costs of a relationship, there's certain costs as well, right? You've got to make effort to nurture that relationship. There's going to be conflict sometimes between the two of you. You're going to have to make sacrifices. Maybe you can't see your friends as often or whatever, right? So there's a bunch of benefits and a bunch of costs associated with being in a relationship and not being in a relationship. So what social exchange theory says is that when people are deciding whether to leave or stay in a relationship, they make that decision by weighing the pros and cons of each and making the decision that maximizes their benefits and minimizes their costs. In other words, what this is saying is that every decision we make is ultimately aimed at maximizing our own happiness in some way. It sort of takes the romance out of a typical perspective on relationships, right? And it sort of boils it down to everything is sort of motivated by maximizing our own benefits. And we're going to see this come into play when we talk about helping behavior later on, as we'll see. But that's what I mean when I say it takes a very economic perspective. It's all about weighing pros and cons. And social exchange theory, by breaking down, like in this case, relationships and choices about relationships to pros and cons, we can also break down other aspects of relationships into this economic perspective as well. So let me give you some examples of what I mean by this. According to social exchange theory, our satisfaction in a relationship is partly a function not just of the other person, as we tend to think it is, right? We think we're satisfied if the other person's treating us well and dissatisfied otherwise, but it's also a function of ourselves. So, for example, they talk about what's known as a comparison level, or a CL for short. What a comparison level means, it's the expected outcome we have of being in a relationship. So, for example, if I have a high comparison level, what that means is I expect relationships to be perfect, right? There should be no conflict or anything like that. It should always be perfectly functioning at all times. And you can imagine that if I have a high comparison level, if I expect things to be perfect all the time, I'm not going to be satisfied very often because the reality is things aren't perfect. So the higher my comparison level, the less likely I am to be satisfied in a relationship because it just becomes harder to meet those higher expectations. And the lower my comparison level, the higher my satisfaction, because a low comparison level means I don't expect relationships to work all that well without conflict. I expect there to be a lot of conflict. But the lower your comparison level, the easier it is to match that expectation or to surpass it, right? So the lower the comparison level I have, the easier it is to meet those minimal expectations, and the more satisfied I happen to be in the relationship. So in other words, satisfaction is not just a function of the other person, it's also a function of you yourself. They also talk about what's known as a comparison level for alternatives, otherwise known as a CL-alt for short. And this is your expectation of what you can get from a different relationship. So if you have, for instance, a high comparison level for alternatives, what that means is that you think there's all sorts of other people that are around you that you would consider dating. Okay. You expect, like if you were single, you'd expect you'd be able to do fairly well dating these other people, right? And alternatively, if you have a low comparison level for alternatives, then you have lower expectations in terms of what outcomes you expect from another relationship. So what happens here is that this is related to your feelings of commitment. Okay. So the higher your CL alt, so in other words, the more attractive alternatives there are to your current relationship, the less committed you feel in your current relationship. And conversely, the lower your CL alt, the fewer people you can see yourself being with, the more committed you get to your current partner because there's like no one else, right? This is the only person you can be with, so you cling on to them. So what that means is that your commitment levels can be a function not just of your relationship, but of other people as well. So let's say, for example, that in high school you are dating someone and you're really committed to them because there's no one else you want to date in your high school, right? Then you come to FIU and you see all these other single attractive people around you. And what happens? You get a little less committed to your current partner, right? Not because the relationship itself changed, but because you're now surrounded by different types of people, which changes your feeling of commitment because of the comparison level for alternatives. Okay. So I just wanted to introduce this basic concept of social exchange theory so you can see how it applies to relationships. But as I said, it's a very general theory that applies to all sorts of decision making, including things like helping behavior. So we're going to come back to look at exchange theory from that perspective as well. Okay, so that is all I have for you today. I will see you next class.